Learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the basics of compassionate behavior, learn the requirements for compassion to evoke, identify the differences between compassion and other related terms, evaluate how someone else's suffering is identified, and analyze the role of compassion in realms of medicine and love. Introduction. Compassion in everyday life. When the terrorist attack happened in Mumbai on 26/11, our hearts went out for people who were trapped inside the hotel, who got killed, and all security officials who laid their lives to combat the terrorists. Our previous generation may have felt in similarly when the Bhopal gas tragedy happened in 1984. Likewise, we feel for people who are suffering in various ways, are fighting terminal illnesses, or, as have we all sadly seen, raped or murdered. Our hearts often go out to people whom destiny victimizes, to those who are not being given the finest treatment by life, and the ones we see are in pain. And not necessarily in times of dire need, people search for compassionate partners, caregivers, psychologists, therapists, physicians, and others who can meet their need for comfort and peace. So, like it presents, compassion is the word most associated with sufferings of others, an emotion evoked by the same. Definition: what is and what is not compassion? As we proceed to define compassion, we need to ensure that we do not confuse it with other related but different moral qualities. Like compassion, often pity can be aroused when we see someone suffer. But pity contains elements of disdain and a sense of interpersonal distance that is absent in compassion. It involves a stance of superiority towards the object of emotion. Qualities of benevolence and altruism again do not hold as equivalent to compassion, hold much broader meanings than compassion, and are not focused on suffering. Also, concern for suffering in compassion is sometimes confused with concern for social justice, but like all the three other qualities discussed, these two again are logically and psychologically distinct. Compassion is primarily focused on a particular individual or situation. Social justice can be very abstract, legalistic, and not involve any particular situation. Social justice primarily involves problems of equality among humans, whereas compassion is not paradigmatically concerned with these problems and may even be focused on animals. Now, when we sympathize with someone, we believe that what the other person is going through is bad, but we do not see it as terrible or tragic event. When we feel compassion, we are usually more deeply affected by the other's condition. The more deeply we are moved by the other's plight, the more intense is our emotional response. Compassion literally means to suffer together. Among emotion researchers, it is defined as the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. It is implied by a basic mutuality in experience of suffering and be in sync with their emotion. Again, compassion is not the same as empathy or altruism as it might sound like from the above definition. Empathy refers to our ability to take the perspective of and feel the emotions of another person, whereas compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. Altruism, on the other hand, is a selfless behavior often prompted by feelings of compassion. However, one can feel compassion without acting on it, and altruism may not always be motivated by compassion.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the basics of compassionate behavior, learn the requirements for compassion to evoke, identify the differences between compassion and other related terms, evaluate how someone else's suffering is identified, analyze the role of compassion in realms of medicine and love. When the terrorist attack happened in Mumbai on 26/11, our hearts went out for people who were trapped inside the hotel, who got killed, and all security officials who laid their lives to combat the terrorists. A previous generation may have felt in similarly when the Bhopal gas tragedy happened in 1984. Likewise, we feel for people who are suffering in various ways, are fighting terminal illnesses, or as we have all sadly seen, raped or murdered. Our hearts often go out to people whom destiny victimizes, to those who are not being given the finest treatment by life, and the ones we see are in pain, and not necessarily in times of dire need. People search for compassionate partners, caregivers, psychologists, therapists, physicians, and others who can meet their need for comfort and peace. So, like its presence, compassion is the word most associated with sufferings of others and emotion evoked by the same. As we proceed to define compassion, we need to ensure that we do not confuse it with other related but different moral qualities. Like compassion, often pity can be aroused when we see someone suffer, but pity contains elements of disdain and a sense of interpersonal distance that is absent in compassion. It involves a stance of superiority towards the object of emotion. Qualities of benevolence and altruism again do not hold as equivalent to compassion, hold much broader meanings than compassion, and are not focused on suffering. Also, concern for suffering in compassion is sometimes confused with concern for social justice, but like all the three other qualities discussed, these two again are logically and psychologically distinct. Compassion is primarily focused on a particular individual or situation. Social justice can be very abstract, legalistic, and not involve any particular situation. Social justice primarily involves problems of equality among humans, whereas compassion is not paradigmatically concerned with these problems and may even be focused on animals. Pence 1983. Now, when we sympathize with someone, we believe that what the other person is going through is bad, but we do not see it as terrible or tragic event. When we feel compassion, we are usually more deeply affected by the other's condition. The more deeply we are moved by the other's plight, the more intense is our emotional response. Snow 1991. compassion literally means to suffer together. Among emotion researchers, it is defined as the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. It is implied by a basic mutuality in experience of suffering and be in sync with their emotion. Again, compassion is not the same as empathy or altruism, as it might sound like from the above definition. Empathy refers to our ability to take the perspective of and feel the emotions of another person, whereas compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. Altruism, on the other hand, is a selfless behavior often prompted by feelings of compassion. However, one can feel compassion without acting on it, and altruism may not always be motivated by compassion. Requirements of compassion. Compassion is the word most often used in connection with the emotion evoked by the suffering of others. Compassion consists of three major requirements as given by Aristotle: realizing that the troubles that evoke our feelings are serious, knowing that the victim's problems are not self inflicted, ability to picture oneself with the same problem, severity of the troubles. No one stands as a judge to how serious are the troubles that have evoked feelings of compassion in us. When sufferings occur from war, homicides, rape, or natural disasters, there often isn't question on how awful things have happened. It is mutually understood both by the onlookers and the victims. But in many situations, such as one where children have grown up and lived through most of such sufferings, they might as well get used to such situations so much that they do not see themselves as sufferers. In a similar way, a person who's suffering from Alzheimer's at times may not at all be aware of his or her difficulty and even then evoke compassion from strangers. So, to re emphasize, compassion is a unilateral emotion and is most commonly brought forth in settings in which victims have no awareness of the feelings they are evoking in others, or as mostly is the case, the victims are not in proximity of the people whose hearts are going out for them. Knowledge of self infliction. The second requirement for the feeling of compassion is to evoke is that the suffering should not be self inflicted, that is, the victim should themselves be not responsible for the sufferings. When one is responsible for the problems he or she is going through, blame centers around them and people do feel that they deserved it for their wrongdoings. However, when sufferings happen without the victims themselves being responsible for it, people tend to feel for them because the situation has been brought up on them by an external force that they do not have control over. Identification with the sufferer. The third requirement for compassion and its associated emotions to arise, one needs to identify with the sufferer. We sympathize with and pity those who are like us in age, character, residence, race, etc. because sharing these similarities also mean that we might have to go through the same fate. What we fear and pray don't happen to us. Evoke pity when it happens to others. Compassion depends on how we identify with the person in question, that is, how we get to know that they are like us. Compassion and identification. Compassion, at its core, is a process of identification with another person and his or her suffering. Human behavior of identification with others begins right when infants learn to imitate by mirroring facial expressions and body movements of mother. They see themselves in the other and the other in themselves. This, of course, shows the newborn infant to be more responsive to its caregivers and its environment, and places the onset of identification at the earliest stage, melts off. Thus, the child sees himself in others and vice versa. The self thereby arises and is developed through social experiences of others and in relation to others. There is no self definition or self without others. Our identities are framed in comparison to similarities and differences with others and not in a vacuum. We try to emulate what we see in others whom we admire, be approved by them, and be like them. But with that, we also try to assert our uniqueness and individuality. So, the desire to be unique is in tension with our social needs, and its place in the spectrum is decided by era, culture, and personality. Within this spectrum, human behavior takes place both with the availability of freedom and conspicuously governed set rules, and we all live through it. This social ubiquity results in a feeling of shared understanding of humanity and accounts for the fact that identification is possible even with people from different nations and dissimilar cultures. A connection thus exists between almost all. The pain of compassion can be brought about by the sufferings of any of the earth's inhabitants. Another possible source of identification has been labeled spirit. Events sometimes reinforce the belief that the connection that underlies compassion cannot be accounted for solely by universal identification born of the social forces described earlier. Rather, all humans are bound together by universal category of spirit. Each human both shares and is part, and this spirit, despite its immense complexities and attendant philosophical disputes, provides a way to explain how all of us unknowingly actively participate in a universal humanity that has concrete existence, also known, whether through spirit or through the shared experience of living, we know others to be like us, and so, when something happens to them, we can identify with their sufferings. When it seems that there might be, at first sight, little conscious basis for identification with sufferers, then the pure bodily source of the suffering pulls compassion from us because everyone has a similar body. The sight of people whose dear ones die in accidents and terrorist attacks holds sad meaning to all of us. Similarly, when children are involved, identification with the helplessness of a child or parental loss is universal. Here we come across another source of identification with others, that is, through knowledge of the human condition. The more we know about others, the less quickly will we assign blame on others for their misfortunes. The frailties and failings of people can be seen in anyone, so that when people suffer from what appear to be their own actions, their fate nevertheless may have been beyond their conscious control. However, the degree of compassion one feels for the other varies on the basis of the degree of identification. Compassion, empathy, pity, and charity all require the ability to identify with another, to see in the plight of another what might cause distress in oneself. But since compassion is often felt towards strangers, this act of identification requires bridging the gap between self and another. When there exists no obvious connection with the others, or for that matter, the connection is conceptual, disconnecting when identification is absent, in the way that identification is required to understand compassion, a complete absence of it requires disidentification, undoing or disconnecting the identification with individuals or groups so as to make them strangers. In many societies, the category of person is extended only to members of the particular tribe or social group. In some tribal languages, a person is someone who is a member of the tribe. Others are not persons and are not due the recognition due humans, an idea that may be exemplified in contemporary African intertribal brutalities. Moss. Compassion may not be extended to the outsiders. When it is clearly marked as to who is and who is not us, the process of disidentification begins. The repeated brutalities by the Nazis during the Second World War period in Germany on all those who were not Germans are the most infamous evidence of this. The facet of human nature that includes them being solitary, poor, nasty, and brutish is kept in check by self interest and the universal fear of death. Compassion lies at the heart of being humans as a social emotion that has to do with the relationship of people to one another. It therefore raises philosophical, political, and ideological questions about the compassion often tells a lot about a person's stances. In this regard, Adam Smith, in his 18th century theory of moral sentiments, very rightly quoted, "How selfish sever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others when we see it, or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner." In the modern era of democracy and capitalism, it was initially doubted if compassion would live up to the new emotions of disidentification that such economic processes were to develop. But as it turned out to be, compassion became one of the primary characteristics of democratic societies. Communities and individuals of the contemporary world mark themselves on the evidences of their compassion. Philanthropy strives on such notions. A study by Skita found that attitudes towards public assistance for victims of severe floods, the political ideology of the respondents was related to their answers to questions about the appropriateness of monetary help. Even in the context of a natural disaster, respondents sought out information about the victims' personal responsibilities. Example, whether they had purchased flood insurance, the place of compassion as a motivation for individual or societal behavior and as one of the foundations for civil society is a continual topic of debate. Brown. Whether compassion stands only as a passion in opposition to reason or is inherently a rational one is still a debate. Nussbaum. Compassion demands knowledge of the suffering of others and moves the compassionate person to action. We have already discussed about the three requirements for compassion, but where does this knowledge of what others are suffering, who they are, and if they are responsible for it originate from? Suffering goes above a normal feeling of physical pain and is highly personal, an affliction of persons. It occurs when persons perceive their impending destruction or loss of integrity as persons, and it continues until the threat of disintegration is past or until the integrity of the person can be restored in some other manner. It is a state of severe distress associated with events that threaten the intactness of person. It is not only psychological or social or physical. It denies the utility of thinking only in all aspects of the person. A person is more than just a mind, a self, or a body. They are the entire complex trajectory through time and space of the wholes that are made up of their past and believed in futures, their family and their family's past, their body and their relationships with their body, relationships with others, day to day behaviors and activities, roles inculcated culture and society, their political dimension, their secret life, their unconscious, and their spiritual dimension. Suffering may occur in relation to any aspect of the person, and since everyone is different and distinct from others, suffering always has an individual and unique meaning too, often marked by self conflict, profound loss, or of change in central purpose and resistance to the loss of personal intactness. Knowledge about suffering. Suffering is lonely. It happens within our personal spaces and is only physically available to the outside world. The individualized and personal nature of suffering further adds onto the loneliness, and that only aggravates suffering. The ones who are suffering may not be completely aware of their suffering and in the early stages be silent about it. They become expressive and sulky later on as they repeatedly tell the story of their victimization as though looking for someone to help in their search for a new story in which they once again became complete, riche. Or it might so happen that one knows the sufferer so well that the roots of his or her sufferings are laid bare. But given that we often don't know ourselves that well, it is quite improbable. We claim to know them well because of the compassion we have in identifying with them. The cause of suffering is often so terrible that had it happened to us, we would have also suffered, and therefore our heart goes out to them. There exists no way of assessing suffering when groups are involved or when those persons experiencing compassion are separated in time or space from the victims. This leads to blind compassion, and it has two difficulties. It may not appreciate that others suffer even if the onlookers do not believe the cause is great enough, or onlookers may believe suffering is present when, in fact, victims have risen above the injury, have grown through their experience, and thus are no longer suffering. The compassionate onlooker may not realize that the victims see the injuries as an opportunity to identify with a larger cause, thus relieving their suffering by giving it meaning. A compassionate person on an individual level can be aware of the situations the victims are going through and also experience a direct transfer of feelings. In closer spaces, the compassionate and the victim share the same universe of dark and light, air, gravity, noise, and quietness. Common values, ideas, beliefs, and aesthetics also create a shared world and identities. Our knowledge of others is a central and constantly expanding feature of life. In other words, we share community, a oneness where all are joined, and from which the absence of the sufferer who is withdrawn into the suffering can be recognized. Thus, compassion is realized through all these methods: identification, knowledge of behaviors, the sights and sounds of suffering, the transfer of feelings, awareness of the change in goals and purposes of sufferers, the sense of absence of the sufferer from the group, and through their mutual reinforcement. Compassion and medicine. A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical services with compassion and respect for human dignity. This stands as the first item on American Medical Association Principles of Medical Ethics. The debate as to what is more important, a competent or a compassionate physician, is still on, as though the two qualities are in conflict, mirroring the dispute over the opposition between reason and passion. Most believe, however, that compassion should be an inherent part of medicine and that physicians should be compassionate. Barber. In general, compassion evokes the desire to do something to relieve the sufferers. This wish to help is not compassion itself, but indicates that it motivates behavior that reduces the tension brought on by the emotion. There can be no objection to someone feeling compassion, but there may be problems associated with the action that might follow. This is why it has been said that unfettered compassion can be as dangerous as an untrained castle. Compassion should be desirable in all helpers, whatever their profession. For physicians, it has come to be treated as a virtue because it is directly related to the identification and treatment of suffering. Physicians concerned only with the manifestations of diseases or the exercise of their technologies may fail to address the suffering that always has its locus in the person rather than only in the body. He or she fails his duties if they fail to deal with the personal level of dealing with the suffering. The central duties of physicians are the fiduciary responsibility to put the patient's interest first, including the duty not to harm, to deliver proper care, and to maintain confidentiality. And each of these aspects, compassion, increases the awareness of the patient's interest, increases the probability that care will be turned to this patient's needs, and promotes the intimacy of knowledge about each patient that physicians require. Dougherty and Putillo. Compassion and love. Love is marked by closeness of connection between the loving parties. Lovers might be capable of experiencing the feelings of the beloved or know what they are thinking, but here it is a kind of love whose desire is to help, to do things for its object, and to obtain the knowledge and information necessary for right action. Schopenhauer quoted, all love is compassion or sympathy. At one end, compassion is the emotion evoked by the suffering of strangers with whom some identification is possible.
Summary. Compassion is the word most associated with sufferings of others and emotion evoked by the same. It is similar to, but essentially different from other related moral qualities like pity, altruism, social justice, etc. For the feeling of compassion to be evoked, the person has to realize that the troubles are serious, the victim's problems are not self-inflicted, and should be able to picture themselves with the same problems. Identification with the sufferers is always necessary for compassion to evoke, and this connection can take place in numerous ways. As a social emotion, compassion raises philosophical, political, and ideological questions, and it often tells a lot about a person's stances on various issues. Knowledge and nature of suffering are important cues for compassion and often from the grounds of sharing identification. In medical profession, compassionate understanding of patients' problems facilitates the healing procedure and also enhances trust. Compassion also makes bonds of love stronger as it helps in understanding the other person more closely and with more affection.